All right. Hey, good morning, everybody. My name is Matt Mayhood. I'm president and CEO of the Silicon Valley organization. And it's great to be here with you this morning. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful Tuesday morning in Silicon Valley. On behalf of our board of directors and the SVO staff, I want to know that our SVO team is here for you and will continue to work hard for you behind the scenes, making sure that our businesses are surviving during this very difficult time and that we're prepared to thrive long after this pandemic and this public health emergency is over. We at the SVO are advocating on your behalf and continuously finding resources to help you stay informed of many of the fluid legislation issues, tax issues, and just things that are affecting your business related to COVID-19. I would encourage you, if you're not a member of the SVO, to go to our COVID-19 resource page. It's constantly being updated with information, resources, tools that will be helpful to your business, so you can check that out at thesvo.com. This morning, we've partnered with longtime SVO member, Hoge Fenton, to bring together a panel of trusted real estate advisors to discuss the impact COVID-19 is having on commercial real estate in Silicon Valley. Hoge Fenton has been a member of the SVO since 1966, and we're very thankful for their partnership and support at the diamond level in our community builder program. Just want to quickly take care of some housekeeping items before we get started. This meeting will be recorded and shared on our website at the SVO by the end of the day. I'm sure Hoge Fenton will be sharing it as well. And to ensure that we have productive dialogue on Zoom, all meeting participants are muted upon entry. We do have pre-submitted questions that will be taken into consideration by the panel, and they will be answered. Sorry about that. They will be answered as soon as they get into the chat box as well. If you have questions, you can write them into the chat box as well, and we'll be able to address those. So we're going to get started. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce our panel of real estate experts. I will start first with former Assemblywoman Catharine Baker. Catharine is now serving as special counsel at Hoge Fenton. Next, Sean Cottle, attorney and shareholder at Hoge Fenton and former SVO board member, actually former board chair of the SVO. Walt Stephenson, he's the managing director at Cushman and Wakefield. Ralph Barnett, managing director, SBA lending and construction, and CRE lending at Bridge Bank. Bridge Bank, also an SVO member, and I'm sure Ralph has been pretty busy lately with all the SBA loans. And last but certainly not least, here to moderate today's conversation, Stephen Kahn. Stephen is an attorney and shareholder and chair of the real estate practice group at Hoge Fenton. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you and take it away, Stephen.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Matt, for that introduction. I want to thank everyone for joining us today for this webinar. We are very honored to have the opportunity to present in conjunction with the SVO. As Matt mentioned, we're longtime members and very proud participants of the SVO. Today we have a great panel to talk to you about what's going on in the real estate world, specifically commercial real estate in Silicon Valley. We've been about a month into the shutdown. I like to call it the shut off. And now we're starting to see trends. We're starting to see things change. And we feel like it's important to advise our community about what we're seeing and what we can expect. So we assembled a great panel to help educate us a bit. Matt gave some introductions, and what I'd like to do to start it out is give an idea of what are the big picture questions that we hope to address in the next hour for you. For us, we think the focus is going to be what are the biggest immediate impacts so far that we've observed in our respective industries. So Sean Cottle is going to talk about it from a real estate and legal perspective. Walt Stephenson's going to talk about it from a commercial real estate, both landlord and tenant side perspective. Ralph Barnett's going to talk about it from a lending perspective. And I know from the questions that we've received, there's a lot of interest in, well, the basic question, how do I get money? And Ralph is hopefully going to help us solve for that. And Catherine Baker is going to talk about what the perspective is from the local and state government level. A critical component of responding to COVID generally, and then specifically as to real estate, is how are governments dealing with this? What types of services are important? What's running? What isn't running? And how is that going to impact the ability for the commercial real estate markets to move forward? So those are the general themes that we hope to cover today. First, I want to turn it over to Catherine. As Matt mentioned, Catherine is representing California's 16th Assembly District from 2014 to 2018. That includes the Tri-Valley and other areas in the Bay Area. We're proud to have her as part of Hoge Fenton before, and very proud to have her back as special counsel at Hoge Fenton. Catherine, when she was in the legislature, focused on education, government efficiency, and that's particularly important today with all of the governments responsible for managing a crisis and funding new programs and dealing with funding for those programs. So Catherine, turning it over to you, what has been your view in the past month of how local cities and governments are dealing with real estate matters and how they're trying to triage this situation?
Yeah, thank you, Stephen, and all panelists and everyone for participating. I think I speak on behalf of everyone. We hope you are all healthy and safe and well, and we're looking forward to seeing and sharing as much helpful information as possible. So I want to start a little bit just from the state level. It's so easy to see on the news and in our social media feeds and otherwise what's happening at the national and the regular briefings that the governor gives, but there's a little bit more behind the scenes at the state level as well as local government. The legislature is out of session. They originally had a spring break session scheduled of about a week, and they extended that through May 4th. I used to joke when times were funnier that if the legislature is out of session, that's a good thing for most folks in California. But right now it's good for everyone that they're physical distancing. They are expected to come back on May 4th. In what form is unknown, and that of course could change. Right now, that means no legislative business is happening. The biggest items that they will take on coming back, when they come back and in whatever form they come back, if it's remote or some form of in-person, they've said they're only going to focus on three things. The first is COVID-19 and anything related to the virus. The second is wildfire and fire related. I know that hasn't been at the forefront of our minds right at this moment, but that is considered one of the essential items that the legislature will be dedicating time to. And then the third is the budget. The budget is actually the only constitutionally required thing that the legislature can do for the rest of the year. If they didn't pass a single additional bill, it wouldn't cause too many constitutional issues, but the budget has to be passed by June 15th. And the budget is where we'll see not only enhanced funding, most likely, but we'll see a completely different world with respect to what funding programs are going to be happening at the state level. Now, in the middle of May, at some point, and the governor has indicated he is still expecting to do this, there's what we hear called a budget May revise. That's where, back in January, the governor said, here's what I'd like my budget to look like in the next fiscal year. And here's what our funds look like right now, halfway through the current fiscal year. May is when that's revised based on the tax receipts that come in, which has changed, as you know, with the deferrals to when taxes are paid, going completely into another fiscal year. And so the May revise will be happening. It's one of the most watched issues with respect to what our local government budgeting is going to be and other state programs. So that's some of the things we should expect to see at the state level. That, I think goes well into what we're going to start seeing at the local level, because our local governments are going to be very dependent on what the state's going to be, what policies are going to set, both for the paying of taxes as well as what that May revise will look like. That has implications for what their stressed budgets will be. Before I get to local cities, really, I think one of the things mostly I hope you've observed is that as much as we hear at the national level and certainly the state briefings that we get, it's county health officials and counties that really drive what can and cannot happen in our jurisdiction with our local economy. And I'm not trying to weigh in on the constitutional debate that's happening in some news outlets, but really county health officials, and certainly with Santa Clara leading, the 6 primary Bay Area counties have been coordinating together in their orders. Their orders are identical. They may present them somewhat differently on their websites with the frequently asked questions or otherwise, but they have been identical, and they've been very, very, I wouldn't say deferential, but Santa Clara is definitely leading when it comes to what policy we are seeing set. So at the local level, of course, we had the revised order out 2 weeks ago that narrowed even further what businesses were allowed to remain open and under what circumstances, and I think we can go into a lot of detail in the Q&A about that. But until at least through May 3rd, essential business only is conducted, as I'm sure you know. That's been defined even more strictly than it was for the first few weeks of the shelter in place. And we're going to go over it a little bit here, but Santa Clara has done a great job, and the surrounding counties, of not only the details of what is essential business, but how they've pared that down. And for this purposes of this call, I think we'll have some questions about what construction is allowed and otherwise, and I can defer and wait till we get to that point. But under that order, that's really what the local cities are abiding by. Cities aren't setting up their own individual policies. Where they are setting up individual policies, it's a little bit different, is what services remain open. Most city governments have their staff still working remotely. They are responding to emails. They are responding to phone calls that go to voicemail, and they're trying to keep up as much as they possibly can. Where you'll see some difference is jurisdictions have some difference of what permitting they're allowing. For example, some of the communities in the East Bay and Southeast Bay, getting further into Silicon Valley, are only allowing essential businesses to submit permits and to be considered. And then you have to make your case as to whether or not you're essential, mostly by email and some phone conversations. Others are proceeding as if, they're just doing everything remotely. So we're going to need to look at almost a city by city look at that for the Valley and the Greater Bay Area, wherever you may be doing business. And so that's one area that is a little bit different, is what permitting they're still allowing. Most city councils and city governments are beginning to transition to city councils that have public meetings that are online, but their planning commissions are not meeting. They're not considering new projects. They're only dedicating their time to what is the most essential. It has to be conducted. We'll see if that changes after May 4th. But that's a bit of a difference right now. You're not going to see a lot of new zoning decisions made and development applications reviewed. So that's some of what we're seeing in the local government area. I'm happy to go into detail about construction and how that's being dealt with, but that's enough perhaps of a monologue right out the gate, and leave to additional conversation.
Thank you, Catherine. It's a good monologue out of the gate because it sets it up well for some questions for Walt Stephenson. Before I turn it over to Walt, I just want to make a few more points about him. He's the managing director at Cushman and Wakefield in San Jose. He focuses on Silicon Valley commercial real estate. He's brokered over $1.1 billion with a B in transactions and for over 7.3 million square feet of space. That's a lot. So he's really connected with the Silicon Valley commercial real estate space. He represents folks in high technology, healthcare, commercial retail, even higher education, and both on the landlord and tenant side. So turning it over to you, Walt, you've heard some comments from Catherine about how things are slowing down, but at the same time, local governments are making a push to either work remotely or address what's most important in this COVID age. From your perspective, is anything still happening in the market? What changes are we seeing? Are deals being slowed down or sped up? What's the response in the past month that you've observed?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Quickly answering, there are some deals still happening and some things still moving ahead, and I'll kind of go into that in a second. I think the biggest thing that we're seeing here in the market is uncertainty. We're usually, for the most part, landlords, tenants, and brokers are kind of all on the same page with where the market is currently and where things are going in the foreseeable future. At this point, you're hearing different opinions really from everyone. You'll see some groups who really think that this is just kind of a speed bump and that everything will kind of rebound by the end of the year. And you will see some groups that really think that this is a complete doom and gloom situation. So for deals that are already in place and that have to happen, especially for lease renewals, you're seeing these real differing of opinion, which is making it challenging in putting deals together right now. That's probably the biggest thing that you're seeing. I think from the tenant side, you're seeing a lot reevaluate what they're doing. There certainly are going to still be relocations that are going to be happening, but for expansions that were maybe nice to have, those may be reevaluated and end up doing kind of a short-term renewal to more go and reevaluate once things kind of settle down and they can see what things look like going forward. Deals that were far enough in the deal cycle process where they were maybe already in leases and kind of moving ahead, some have closed. I mean, I've put together 2 or 3 decent sized deals, over the past couple of weeks where we were already in leases. There were maybe a couple of tweaks that happened because of this, but they still moved forward. For tenants more in that kind of initial stage of any deal that are out touring spaces, the overwhelming majority of them are just on hold. When you talk to the brokers who represent these companies, it just says, hey, we're on hold until COVID kind of figures itself out or until the shelter in place is lifted. So there's really just kind of a lot of on hold. Have there been a few deals that have fallen apart because of this? Yeah, there absolutely have been. But I wouldn't call that substantial at this point. I think really now it's everything is kind of uncertain. Deals that weren't kind of past a certain point are just on hold for the time being, to kind of pick everything up here in the next couple of weeks.
Those are good comments. Thanks, Walt. So when you talk about things being uncertain and on hold, my ears as an attorney kind of perk up a bit because risk is something that we think about a lot. So I want to turn this over to my colleague, Sean Cottle, let him weigh in on that a little bit more. Just for reference, Sean is a shareholder at Hoge Fenton like me. He works transactional real estate matters. He focuses on real estate deals, planning, vision for Bay Area clients, particularly in San Jose and Silicon Valley, sale, leasing, of just about every type of non-residential, non-house real estate, so industrial, retail, residential development. Sean's been an attorney for 25 years. As I think anybody who knows Sean knows, he's super connected in San Jose and Silicon Valley. He's got his ear to the ground and he knows the word on the street. So turning it over to Sean. Sean, you heard Walt's comments about everybody's kind of in a wait and see approach, doesn't know what's going to happen in the future. What are you observing from both a market perspective and then a legal perspective? What types of issues are our clients and folks in the CRE industry facing or anticipating that have legal impact?
Well, thank you, Stephen. And like Catherine, I just want to wish everyone safe and hopefully everyone is well, sheltering in their place. But I'd like to make this observation. We've had a pretty good run for 12 years for the real estate industry since the Great Recession in 2008. And it's taken a global pandemic to basically slow the growth rate now in real estate. So now there'll be a pause. I think it's a question of how long is that pause going to be? And we'll have to wait and see. My question is, will it be a V-shaped curve or will it be a U-shaped curve? I think since the economy was stronger now than it was in 2008, I'm cautiously optimistic that it will be a V-shaped curve, or if it is a U-shaped curve, I think it'll be I hope it will be a shallow U-shaped curve. So what are the industries that are most impacted or have been impacted so far by the COVID-19 pandemic? Well, I think everyone would argue that their industry themselves or for themselves is the most impacted. But from my observations, I think the key industries that have been impacted the most are the hospitality and the non-essential retails industries. Because you've got the essential retail, pharmacies, restaurants that are doing takeout, but then you've got the non-essential businesses and services that have had to be shut down since in the Bay Area since March 17th and statewide 2 days later by Gavin Newsom's safety order. So also the industries that have been impacted, as you heard from Walt, are the landlord and the tenant industries, in particular the small businesses, the tenants that are small businesses that have had to close down and not generating revenue. So do those businesses have enough in reserves to pay their rents? You know, in April 1st, people started questioning whether they had the right resources to pay rent. And although we're focusing on commercial, I'll just give you a little tidbit that I heard statistically this week that on a national level, 1/3 of residential renters, 1/3 of all renters in the residential arena did not pay their rent for April. So you can imagine what's happening. Hopefully in the commercial industry, it's not as impactful on the small businesses, but I'm sure there are some that are having their conversations with their landlords. And I think that communication between the landlords and the tenants is key at this time. And another industry that's been impacted so far in the Silicon Valley is obviously the construction industry, especially since the March 31st, 2020 revision to the shelter-in-place order that came out and more narrowly defined what was permissible under the construction arena. So if you're not in essential construction for essential governmental function, or if you're in the construction area, if your project has an affordable component of 10% or more, that's permissible. But other than that, the construction, especially if you drove around downtown trying to get your exercise and things like that, you'll notice that a lot of the projects have just halted. And they had to do what was necessary to protect their product, protect the construction from a safety standpoint. And that took a couple of days. But once that took place, they just had to shut down. So those are the industries that I see being impacted. So what are the opportunities that are arising right now? Well, as Walt said, you know, when people are out looking, there will be tenants looking for space. And I think that those tenants that are looking for space will be looking for smaller footprints because companies have realized that as of March 17th, or even some companies before March 17th were going into a remote shutdown. Those companies are realizing that remote working places actually work. So I truly believe the biggest change that will be coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 will be the downsizing of businesses and the realization that the remote working arrangements work. That's going to cut down on the long commutes from the Central Valley to the Bay Area. And I also think that the companies are going to invoke some flex time working, you know, bringing people back in, not with the entire work staff, but I think that when Gavin Newsom and, as Catherine pointed out, the health directors of the various counties come forward and start releasing the shelter-in-place order, I think that the workers are going to come back, not all at once, but there will be some flex working. So I think that going forward, that will be the biggest change coming out in the real estate market or the real estate industry will be the change in the size of the footprint that companies are going to have looking to establish in Santa Clara, as well as, you know, nationwide in the commercial industry. Also, the tenants are going to be looking for cheaper rent. As you may have read in the Silicon Valley Business Journal yesterday, the asking rents have begun to decline for the first time in 2 years. So that's a big impact that's going to occur for the next couple months. Also, real estate developers. I think real estate developers, there's going to be some that are going to be getting into the market because they're going to be looking for those deals. And those that are currently in contract, there may be some renegotiating of existing deals if they can. And also the developers are going to have to contend with the loans, and that's what we're going to look for Ralph Barnett to talk about in a little bit. So I thought it was interesting. If people aren't reading the Silicon Valley Business Journal, that's a wealth of information. Kudos to their staff that's still reporting during this. And I like the article that appeared yesterday where the reporter asked the panelists if there was going to be any loans making, and it's not likely that there will be any loans being made for commercial development because the lenders don't have the data that they need to make those decisions. So I will quote Phil Mahoney, as he said yesterday in the article, that currently the pencils are down. So it's going to be interesting to see what projects will go forward, if any, in the near future. So that's basically what I see, Stephen, going forward for the near term in the real estate community.
Thank you, Sean. Those are good observations and good tips for everybody who's watching us and joining us today. So I'm going to turn it over to Ralph Barnett because, Sean, when you mentioned pencils being down, I'm pretty sure Ralph's pencil is definitely working hard these days on a lot of lending projects, hopefully for our participants in the realm of commercial real estate. But before I turn it over to Ralph, I want to say a little bit more about Ralph. He's the Senior Vice President and the Real Estate Lending Division Manager at Bridge Bank, which is part of Western Alliance Bank. He oversees residential, commercial construction financing, land acquisition, commercial real estate deals. He's been a banker since 1989, started at Cupertino National. He's been at Bridge since 2002. He was recognized as the Financial Services Advocate of the Year by the SBA for his role as president of the Bay Area Association of Government Guaranteed Lenders. And I point that out because I think it's particularly relevant right now since we're dealing with a lot of new SBA products, a lot of new lending products from the government. And circling back to what I said at the beginning, how do people get their money in these circumstances? So Ralph, turning it over to you, what's keeping you busy these days, and do you have any news, perhaps positive news for the CRE industry from a lending perspective?
Okay. Well, a couple of things. First, I also wear another hat, and that hat is SBA lending activity for the bank still. And so as you can imagine with the CARES Act and the SBA Paycheck Protection Program loan, that has taken up a considerable amount of our time trying to get that ramped up and get that money out the door. I'll touch on that a little bit later, but on my CRE hat, as Sean mentioned, you have to keep in mind a lot of the information is still just not in for banks yet. Everything is lagging a little bit. The information we're getting in, for example, on land acquisition appetite has slowed dramatically, which doesn't surprise too many people because those are generally going to be speculative in some form or fashion. On our end, loans that were approved prior to, call it, March 16th, March 17th, shelter in place, we're still closing on those. We're actually still funding on some new loans. We're entertaining new applications, but it's really with the very seasoned developers. And for the most part, most of them have pulled back significantly on it. Those that were in contract have either tried to renegotiate prices, and if not successful in that, they've canceled those transactions. So while banks are entertaining new requests, it's sort of equated to we're walking through a fog right now, and that fog is fairly thick. 30 days, 45 days from now, we do expect the fog to lift a little bit, but I don't think we're going to see too much clear direction for another 60 days. And I definitely agree with Sean. I mean, we're going to be entering some sort of recession. We hope it's a V shape or mild U shape as well. But we have to look for direction from the regulators as well. And we have a feeling that they're going to be coming down fairly hard on commercial real estate for the reasons that Sean and Walt were talking about, in terms of the uncertainty on what's going on out there. We do understand in the retail world, a lot of retailers, as well as Sean mentioned, the tenants, about a third of the residential side have made the rent payments. Many real retailers did make their April payment. They're not expected to make their May payment. I think part of that is it's just too early to see the impact if the CARES Act has had on the economy yet. That money is just now starting to get out. We funded about $100 million on Monday. We expect another $150 million to go out today. And so the money is starting to roll out there. And that is geared for those small businesses, those tenants that are in those, especially in the non-essential area, to pull the people back to work. And part of their money is supposed to be used for making their rent payments as well. I know one of the questions that was shared with me, and I'll touch on that briefly, this is geared primarily towards owner-occupied commercial real estate projects. The SBA is still actively financing, the traditional SBA loan programs. And so one of them out there that can be useful for owner-occupied is the SBA 504 program, where the bank takes half of that loan on and the SBA takes the other half of that loan on. And those rates, the rate was less than 2.9%. Fixed for 25 years at the last time. That was for the back end SBA piece. And as for those of you watching what treasury rates are doing right now, they have plummeted probably 20, 25 basis points since probably March 16th on the long-term rates. And so we've seen a significant downward trend on those rates, pressure on that. So I think banks will slowly reemerge on here. I don't think it's going to be business as usual once, let's say, we get back to March 4th, just because, again, that fog hasn't quite lifted yet. And I think we just need to start to get some more information in. And so what Sean and Walt were talking about in terms of, let's see what data is starting to roll in terms of rental rates, cap rates, and see what the trends are looking like there before we fully re-engage. I think it's going to be several months after sort of we feel things are behind us before the banks are going to be running full steam again. Right now, we are working very heavily on, so what are we doing with clients that are having some issues right now? Bank is assessing them case by case, and I think all banks are going through this. We're sort of two fronts right now. Helping out existing clients with payment deferrals as necessary, either reducing their loan payments, modifying them, extending them, is one option. And then the other one most banks are running full steam on is trying to get the money out through the CARES Act stimulus program. And that has been, again, a major focus, I think, for a lot of lenders out there. So.
Thanks, Ralph. Those are great comments and insightful and a bit stark, but the reality that we need to hear. A couple of things you said perked my interest. Turning it back over to Walt for a minute, I heard Ralph talk about a slowdown coming, potentially a recession coming. Walt, is there anything unique about Silicon Valley that you anticipate will allow it to weather this coming slowdown better, or something unique about Silicon Valley that might make it more impacted by the slowdown that's coming from both the amount of money that's coming in from lenders and the amount of money that's not coming in from commercial and residential tenants who are filling these buildings?
Yeah, I think when you look at for the Valley here, when you look at the number of companies that are headquartered here, or maybe for a lot of multinational corporations have decided to put their US headquarters here within the Silicon Valley, it's really going to help weather the storm. We're not going to see a lot of these kind of either large scale or mid-sized companies kind of fold up. So I think that is really going to help keep our occupancy numbers higher. I think where there really is a concern is going to be with the sales offices that are here, or those kind of small offices that companies have to work with their clients who are here. From this working at home environment, they may come out of this and realize that they don't necessarily need that 3,000 or 10,000 square foot kind of regional office that they have just to go and meet with a lot of their clients who are based here locally. And, some may, if the price is right, they may try to pull out of those very quickly. Some may just not renew those leases as they go forward. I think a really important aspect of how those kind of sales offices or regional offices are going to be treated is going to have largely to do with how a lot of the major companies here, a lot of the major employees, your Google, Apple, Cisco, LinkedIn, how are they going to treat non-employees coming onto their campus for meetings going forward? If all of a sudden Google says, hey, you may be one of our partners, we work on things together, but until there's some vaccine, we're just not going to have non-employees, coming on site, on campus for meetings, then a lot of those sales offices that are out here really, may go away or be put on hold and change the landscape of it pretty significantly. There are a lot of companies that have these regional offices here just to meet with those tenants and those companies. And so if those policies change for meetings, that will have a dramatic impact on a lot of those smaller offices.
That's a great point. I hadn't considered that, but you're right. Companies will probably start being less inclusive of the outside world until we get a handle on what's happening with COVID. Turning it over to Catherine, that gets me thinking about the public-private partnership that we have. If companies are considering pulling out of their smaller regional offices or changing how they work, for example, recognizing that some of their workforce doesn't really need to come to the office, what type of influence or impact is it going to have from a public-private perspective, and how are local communities and governments going to try and address this, perhaps foster things so there isn't such a dramatic change as a consequence?
Yeah, and I go a little bit back to the comments we just heard. There are some aspects throughout all of our communities that are shared that are still going to get hit very, very hard. And those are ones that are difficult to see make a quick comeback. I'm thinking of, say, the restaurant industry, for example. I was on a call with one of the trade associations for the restaurant and hospitality service industry, and they think a good 30 to 40% of the businesses in California that fit that profile are not going to be able to come back at all. And so you're going to see, that base, and, restaurants drive people to get out in their community and spend next door as they go walking after the restaurant, or maybe to, movie theaters are going to be hit very hard, and performing arts centers that are often a generator of economic activity in a downtown or central core area of some of our communities. And they also are often either, those say the theater centers are owned or subsidized by our local governments. A lot of those theater centers, for example, are totally shut down. And even if we have, lightening up, however we want to say it, of the shelter at home, those are the areas that many could say are the least likely to happen soon. And they're the ones that local governments have a good deal of exposure to in terms of the lack of economic activity they're generating, and they may even fund, if not own, those centers. And so I want to add that component to this. And we're talking about headquarters of businesses and sales offices. There's also just some of the retail and other generators of local economic activity that even if we're going to have a flat U-shape, they're going to be the ones that I think are very strongly hit. And they're often in partnership with our local governments. An additional component of this is something that has happened during the shelter in place, and that is split roll has qualified for the November ballot. And whether or not the proponents of split roll, which is of course removing, some would say modifying, I say removing the Prop 13 protections for commercial property, are whether they're going to push to make sure that happens in November. I think there's going to be some real pressure on local governments that are seeing their property tax and their sales tax not come in their fiscal year and be dramatically reduced to push for that as a backfill for some of what they use to be in funding their budgets and to be in any kind of public or private partnerships. So that's a real question mark of uncertainty that's over the business community and commercial property and local governments right now. Is what are they going to do with split roll? It's not at the forefront of many folks' minds right now because November seems like an eternity away, but it's just a few months away, and the decision about whether or not it goes forward on the ballot is not that far off. So I give those components update as well. In addition, local governments are going to do everything they can to try to preserve their core business community, and they're going to have major stresses on their budgets, but they're going to be looking for every way in which they can partner with our local business associations and others to provide support. Some local governments in the Bay Area, been a little bit more prominent elsewhere in California, but in the Bay Area, are looking to offer their own loan assistance programs. They have also put in place their own commercial eviction moratorium. We've certainly heard about that for residential and rental evictions, but it's a little bit of a spotty practice. It's not Bay Area wide that there's commercial eviction moratorium in place in some jurisdictions. Those are examples of what the local governments are going to try to do. And I'll put one more, probably sounds like a Debbie Downer, but it's important to know that this is an additional pressure on our local governments. I mentioned split roll and how that may become a backfill for the funding that they need to be supporting their communities. But they're also having to deal with their pension obligations. CalPERS is heavily dependent on what happens in the stock market. And CalPERS is the state financial pension board and system. And local governments going into this year, we're already very much seeing a crowding out of their funding from pension programs. This is going to make it worse for two reasons. COVID-19 is making it worse. I've already talked about how their income stream is disrupted, but they have major pension payments that they need to make. And when CalPERS has a shortfall because the stock market has gone down, it's our local governments that have to pay for that. And those payments don't get deferred. So going into the next few months, you're going to see local governments very much eager to support their communities in any way they can. Loan assistance programs, eviction moratoria, and other policies, but it's at the same time they have some major stresses coming in place. So we've got to be looking out for that. That's not county driven. That really is dependent on each individual city jurisdiction. I hope that answers your question, Stephen, and without being too much of a downer.
That does answer my question. And no, you're not too much of a downer. I think that's a fair reality check. And it's actually a positive message because it tells us that local communities are anticipating ways that they can backfill their budgets and find a way to continue providing the necessary services. And from our perspective here, that may fall to the CRE industry with split roles and other charges. I want to throw it back to Sean and ask him a positive question. Sean, do you see that we have any opportunities in the commercial real estate space with the new CARES Act or structures for financing and holding real property or doing deals that might be more attractive now or available now than before because we're dealing with this changing landscape?
Well, the CARES Act does provide loan opportunities. I think it's more of a stopgap opportunity for property owners, landlords, tenants to try to get those low interest rates through the SBA, through Ralph's Bank and other banks that are out there lending. So those opportunities do exist, but you also need to, whether it's an opportunity, you can look at it as an opportunity, you can look at it as, depending upon whether you're the tenant, the commercial tenant, or whether you're the commercial landlord. But there are, as Catherine mentioned, there is the moratorium on eviction, and you need to, being the attorney as I am, my recommendation is you need to check the jurisdiction where your property is. I'll talk about Santa Clara in particular. They put in a moratorium on March 24th, saying that in addition to residential tenants, commercial tenants, small business tenants cannot be evicted from their location prior to, or the moratorium is in place until March 31st. So once either the moratorium is repealed or extended, if it's repealed after March 31st, the commercial tenants then have 120 days to come current on their payment of rent. People, I think there's been either a lack of communication or miscommunication or selective hearing on some of the people in the population, that they hear rent deferment and they don't understand that rent deferment means just that. They are deferring the payment of their commercial rent amount. And that means that if they choose not to pay April, if they choose not to pay May, please communicate that, discuss that with your landlord. There's particular documentation that the tenants have to provide, and working with their landlords, they don't have to, or they can work into a payment program that they don't have to pay the rent until September 28th, 120 days from March 31st, or excuse me, May 31st. From May 31st, 120 days to September 28th. So they come current on September 28th. They're all fine and well. They don't have to be charged, or they don't get charged penalties or late fees. But after September 28th, if they are not current, then they run the risk, if they haven't communicated and had a conversation with their landlord, they run the risk of having unlawful detainer actions proceed. So that, again, depends upon how you want to look at it. That's either a positive for the tenants or it could be a negative for the landlords. But again, they should have that level of communication. And briefly, two other points that I'd like to bring up that at the federal government that people should be aware of. People may have heard about the opportunity zones concept. Since California has been declared a disaster area, the working capital safe harbor plans that the opportunity zone businesses have in place are being extended out 24 months. So in addition to the first 31 months, they now have an additional 24 months on top of their plan. So they have a total of 55 months to complete that plan from the opportunity zone, opportunity fund perspective. And also the 1031 exchange program, that the IRS has also modified those deadlines. So they say that if there's any deadline that became due between, I think it's April 1st and June 30th, those deadlines are being extended out to July 17th. So be aware of those changes to the 1031 exchange program. that's what I see as some of the positive aspects that have come out of the legislations that have been enacted, Stephen.
Thank you, Sean. And those are good points for our viewers today about some positive opportunities, and that at least legislation is catching up and giving everybody equal or more time for 1031s or opportunity zones to catch up. So in hearing your comments about, let's see, eviction moratoriums, rent deferral or rent forbearance, what I think of that about is people aren't paying on their mortgages, particularly in the CRE space, which means that products aren't performing and banks are going to have some stress over that. I want to turn it back over to Ralph and ask him, if we've got 3 or 4 months of tenants not paying and landowners not being able to perform on their loan products, where do we end up in 4 months? And a question that we got from a lot of visitors before the webinar is, have we heard anything about mortgage relief from the government for commercial property owners? Everybody's talking about mortgage relief for individuals, even for businesses, but what about commercial property? Do you know of any? Is it coming? What can you tell us?
Okay. So again, first on our end, one of the things we're doing with all of our commercial clients, if they have a need for some payment relief, it's not being forgiven. Banks are not that generous, but what we are doing is, putting on either full payment deferrals and then looking to restructure that so they're probably, that deferral is paid back. If we give them a 3-month deferral, that 3-month period is probably going to be repaid over a 12-month period after that, or just reducing it on interest only. We're also encouraging those commercial tenants, if it fits that model of having a tenant that can get one of the SBA loans, having them go out and have that tenant get that SBA loan, because the purpose of that SBA loan is twofold. One, it's supposed to cover payroll costs up to 75%. The money is supposed to be spent on payroll costs. So the idea is, yes, it may not be working, but those people are coming off of unemployment. They're getting their full paycheck rather than a partial unemployment check. But also the proceeds can be used, 25% of that loan can be used for making rent payments and interest payments on their loans. And so the idea is that it is a stopgap measure. We're only talking about pushing it out for about 2 months there. And so I think the federal government's taken incrementally as well because of that, not having that same clear visibility to what's going on out there. Longer term, if we're seeing this going on for a longer period of time, I think it is a bit of a wait and see attitude. If we're sitting in the same position in 3 months with a lot of still shelter in place or a very limited economy, I think we're going to look for some more longer term restructurings with borrowers. But obviously, banks are not going to be able to sustain not receiving payments for an extended period of time. That at some point that will become problematic for banks and their capital positions. The regulators are saying that they're being flexible with banks. They're not criticizing banks for doing these payment deferrals, which is good news, which means that the banks are being more flexible with these payment deferrals than historically we would have been. So I'm not sure answer the question, if there's any follow-up on that.
That does answer the question. I got a question from one of our watchers that I think is appropriate here. She's noting that in her circumstance, some loan officers are refusing deferral or working out terms unless they agree to some form of restructuring of a loan that may allow what she calls greater foreclosure power over the property. Ralph, are you aware of any banks using this as an opportunity to change the leverage since they're necessarily accepting more risk?
I have not been hearing that from my fellow bankers. I can see maybe where some banks might take an opportunity to do something like that, but for the most part, I'm hearing that most banks are being, as we are, reasonably flexible with our clients and understanding that they're going through as hard a time as anyone else and trying to give some relief to them. So I've not heard that they're restructuring to give the bank some more advantage on it.
Thanks for that follow-up. I want to turn it back over to Walt. Walt, this morning I happened to read about a new program that's being put in place by Cushman, and it's attempting to address what's the future of commercial real estate, and particularly offices. I know that Cushman is releasing some information about how to change the organization of office spaces to incorporate social distancing. The term is the 6-foot office with shields that can be put up, and rearranging how people are working within their space so they can feel more comfortable. Do you anticipate going forward tenants and landlords asking for ways to repurpose their space instead of having to move out of it? And then going back to my earlier question, can you forecast, if any, what percentage of workspace is going to be moving more remote, either to homes or to locations elsewhere in the U.S. for folks who may not necessarily need to be in the same physical space as the rest of the country?
Yeah, I'll tackle your second question first with kind of the remote workforce. Working from home isn't something that's new. You know, it's been around for a while. People have worked it. Certainly the technology has evolved and advanced to make it a lot easier. I mean, just look at what we're all working with today with a really well done video chat platform that can accommodate a couple hundred people. I mean, this just wasn't available before. So I think the resources are there to make working from home much more possible. And in terms of, you know, cloud sharing drives and collaboration materials, if there's no better time than now to try to do it. I still think there are the aspects though, where people want to be in the office. Whether it's that kind of personal interaction with their coworkers or bouncing ideas off of people, you know, with their own team or just kind of learning something new. And there's also just the efficiency aspect of it, that working from home really doesn't work for everyone. I mean, there's a lot of jobs that can't necessarily always be done from home. I mean, there's the difficulties where I'm sure everyone's been on multiple conference calls and Zoom calls over the past 5 weeks, and you know, a kid has interrupted it, or a dog, or something. You know, it's just, there's still those efficiency aspects of it. We're going to an office where everyone can be a little bit more focused are important. Do I think that companies are going to expand their work from home policies, or maybe bring on additional technologies to make it easier or make it kind of a better process? I do. I think that's definitely going to be something where people will be encouraged and companies will provide those tools. Do I think it's going to be a significant percentage? No, not really. I think there still is a lot of people that want to be able to be in an office, but I think those policies will be expanded to give people a lot more flexibility. May that result in kind of a smaller headcount or smaller square footage for when people are looking at new offices? Probably. There's probably going to be a reduction where they're going to make sure that there's some amount of hoteling space for people that don't come in all the time to be able to take advantage of kind of a private workspace when they want to come in. But I still think you're going to see a large number of people who still want to come into the office on a regular basis. Kind of on your, sorry, what was then the first question you had talked about again? Was it the change in square footage again?
Yeah. How are commercial real estate users changing their square footage? Have you been asked by any of your clients, for example, hey, we'd like to figure out how to solve for COVID within the space that we've got rather than having everybody work from home forever?
Yeah, I think that's definitely going to change. And you brought up the 6-foot workspace that our company has kind of been piloting there in our Amsterdam office. And I've watched that video several times. I think there's some really interesting aspects that come out of it, you know, of making sure that a lot of these cubes and workspaces, that where people are oriented in their cubes is setting it up so that people are 6 feet away from each other. That you're kind of creating these visual barriers so that you maybe don't have people, you know, multiple people sitting in one cube, and that people are going to be a little bit more separated out. For tenants who still have 2, 3, or 4 years left on a lease, do I think you're going to see a lot of them look to go and reorganize their office space now? Probably not. For tenants who are in the process of relocating right now, those conversations are definitely happening. There's a client we're working on a deal with right now, and they had a pretty dense configuration. It was probably in the 175 square foot per person range, kind of a little bit larger benching style. And in my conversation with the head of real estate the other day, I said, are we changing that plan as we look forward? And kind of the initial indication was we're discussing it on how to change that space going forward as we learn more about it. They don't want to change anything to the current plan so we can kind of move everything ahead, but making sure you have the flexibility to adapt the workspace going forward is going to be really important. And I think for any tenant involved in a relocation, everyone is rethinking, whether it's head of real estate or HR or office manager, is rethinking how furniture layouts are going to be, how those systems are. If there was low style benching cubes, I think you're going to see those kind of see-through screens coming through to kind of help protect people. There's going to be a lot of new things coming out of this, and it's going to be very interesting to watch how companies react to it.
Thank you for that. So we've got 5 minutes left, and Walt has left us with some forecasting and a good tip going forward. I want to get to the rest of our panelists with our remaining time and ask, for the next month or so, between now and when we hope to check in again, do you have a tip or a comment for our viewers about what you see coming in your space or a best practice for the next month? Go first to Catherine.
Well, thank you. During that next month is certainly going to be where we see some of the most immediate change with what the reopening, to whatever degree it's going to happen of our economy, the legislature potentially coming back in. The Senate, state Senate has already said we're going to reduce the number of bills that they're going to see, and the Assembly alone usually votes on about 3,000 bills a year. They're looking at cutting that to 300 or 600 bills. That sounds like too many for a legislature to be working on, but they will. That's a significant drop in what happens, especially I will say in an election year. And so, continuing to work with your trade associations that you're a part of and your local government leaders and whatever relationships you have with them, I think is important. My tip to you is know them. They are looking, and this is also for your local government leaders as well, as much as possible. They're looking for ways to help. They most benefit by not coming up with those themselves, but by hearing from their constituents who are on the ground, who are in that field or industry, to make specific suggestions. So if you're navigating in the next few weeks or months a policy that seems cumbersome, that overlooks an unintended consequence or missed including someone or excluding a program, reach out to those elected leaders at your local and state level. They probably don't know it. And it's most significant now for them to hear from the very people that they're trying to help on what actually works. So that's my tip to all of us going forward in terms of a governmental perspective, is be getting to know them if you don't already, and reach out to them to give input on what you're experiencing so you can help shape the policies they're going to come up with. And especially at our most local level of government, because they're the ones who are trying to help, and that includes the state legislature.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm going to turn it now to Ralph for some brief comments, and I'll finish it up with my partner, Sean.
Great. Next 30 days, I think we're going to, we'll continue to get some information in at a macro level, but our bank is going to be in constant communication with our existing clients to find out what percentage of their tenants are paying rents, and what they're doing with those tenants. Obviously, there's some eviction related issues here in Santa Clara County, but we have a pretty wide footprint, and so it's really staying in touch with them, see what's going on with them. I do expect to see a second stimulus package coming through very soon, and the reason for that is the first round of $350 billion probably will be spent by the end of this week, if not earlier, and so we'll see Congress stepping in further on that. So our next 30 days is going to be staying in touch with clients, assessing what impact they are feeling as they really start to see that being realized, and then still trying to get this next round of stimulus money out to the economy.
Thanks, Ralph. And then turning it over to Sean. Any comments, last parting words for our viewers here?
Sure, Stephen. Thank you very much. One word. Sound like the movie The Graduate, but the one word for the COVID-19 pandemic era that we were in: communication. Communication. This shelter-in-place order has required us to stay in our offices or stay in our homes, stay in our apartments, but we can still communicate. Communicate with your employees, communicate with your bosses, communicate with your landlords, communicate with your tenants, communicate with your lenders. Just maintain that level of communication. Although I am cautiously optimistic that hopefully something will happen beginning May 4th, but we'll know about that in about 59 minutes from now when Gavin Newsom gives his noon update. But again, communicate.
I agree with you, Sean. Communication is key. Speaking of communication, I'm going to throw it back to Matt. Matt, thank you so much for letting us use this platform today to communicate with the Silicon Valley community, with the SVOs community, and for being our gracious host.
Great. Thank you, Stephen, Catherine, Sean, Walt, Ralph, and Stephen. That was great. Really appreciate all your input and your insights today. It was interesting to listen to and participate. And I think it was helpful for all of the 200 plus folks who participated. I know there's a lot of changing information going on out there. The landscape continues to change, and the SVO is working with our members like Hoge, Fenton, and many of our other community partners to put together ongoing programs to keep all of our members informed. So thanks to Hoge, Fenton, and all of you for participating in this webinar today. So go check out the SVO's latest updates on COVID-19 on our website at thesvo.com. And with that, let's continue to maintain our social distance, our sheltering at home. And I know as a community, we're going to come out stronger than ever on the other side of this. So please take care and stay healthy. I usually say go out and have a prosperous day, but it's more important right now we stay healthy. So with that, thank you very much and have a great day. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.